The border between the United States and Canada stretches for more than 5,000 miles. It cuts through forests, rivers, frozen lakes, quiet towns, and empty plains. No walls, no bunkers, no permanent military checkpoints. For generations, it has been called the longest peaceful border on Earth. But history has a way of hiding uncomfortable truths. Because there was a time, not in ancient history, not in medieval times, but in the modern age, when American generals quietly asked a question that seems impossible today. What if the United States had to invade Canada? Not as a joke, not as speculation, but as a real, written military plan. That plan had a name, War Plan Red, and if history had taken a slightly different turn, North America might never have been the same. The story begins in the shadow of the First World War. Europe was broken. Empires had fallen. Millions of soldiers never came home. And the world no longer believed in the idea of permanent peace. In Washington, military leaders came to a hard conclusion. The next war would not announce itself politely. So the United States Army began preparing for every possible enemy, even the ones that seemed unlikely. Germany had a plan. Japan had a plan. Mexico had a plan. And so did Britain. At the time, Britain was still the most powerful empire on Earth. Its navy controlled the oceans. Its colonies spanned the globe. And just north of the United States sat one of its most valuable possessions, Canada. If war ever erupted between the United States and Britain, American planners believed one thing was certain: Canada would become the battlefield. British warships could use Canadian ports. British troops could land on Canadian soil. And from there, American cities would be within reach. To prevent that, the U.S. Army created a series of color-coded war plans. Each color represented a potential enemy. Germany was black, Japan was orange, Britain was red, and Canada was given a new name, Crimson. War Plan Red was finalized in 1930. It was never approved by Congress. It was never announced to the public. It existed quietly, in locked filing cabinets, meant for a war everyone hoped would never come. But the plan was detailed, disturbingly detailed. It assumed diplomacy had failed. It assumed negotiations were over. And it assumed that the United States would need to act first. There would be no long build-up, no slow mobilization. Speed was everything. American generals believed Canada's greatest weakness was time. If the United States moved quickly enough, Canada could be overwhelmed before Britain could respond. The goal was not conquest, not occupation, not revenge. The goal was neutralization. Remove Canada from the war, and Britain would lose its North American foothold. To do that, War Plan Red divided the invasion into multiple lightning strikes. The first thrust would come from the east. American forces would cross north from Vermont and New York, aiming straight for Montreal and Quebec City. Montreal was Canada's industrial engine. Rail lines, factories, and supply routes converged there. Quebec City controlled access to the St. Lawrence River, the gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the heart of Canada. If those cities fell, eastern Canada would be paralyzed. Bridges would be seized, railways cut, telegraph lines destroyed. Communication would collapse within days. Further west, a second offensive would surge north from the American plains. From North Dakota, U.S. troops would advance toward Winnipeg. Winnipeg wasn't the largest city in Canada, but it was one of the most important. It was the central railway hub. Every major line connecting eastern and western Canada passed through it. Capture Winnipeg, and Canada would be split in half. No reinforcements, no coordination, no rapid response. Then came the third and most decisive push. From the Great Lakes region, Michigan, Ohio, and surrounding states, American forces would strike into Ontario. This was Canada's economic heartland. Toronto, Hamilton, Ottawa, factories, government offices, financial centers. If Ontario fell, organized Canadian resistance would likely collapse. The plan assumed Canadian forces would fight bravely, but briefly. The real clock was not Canadian resistance. It was the British Navy, and that is why one city mattered more than all the others. Halifax. Halifax was Canada's Atlantic lifeline. If British troops were coming, if ships were crossing the ocean, they would arrive there. War Plan Red demanded that Halifax be seized as fast as possible. American naval forces would establish a blockade. Marines would land. The harbor would be captured. No port, no reinforcements, no second chance. In theory, the war could be decided in weeks, but there was something the plan could never fully account for. Human cost. Imagine it. Soldiers crossing a border that had never known war. Cities waking up to explosions instead of traffic. Neighbors suddenly becoming enemies. Montreal, a city of culture and history, turned into a front line. Toronto's skyline shadowed by smoke. Families fleeing south and north, unsure where safety even existed. Even a successful invasion would leave scars that would never heal. And Canada was not completely unprepared. Years earlier, Canadian officers had drafted their own emergency plan. It was called Defense Scheme No. 1. It was bold and deeply risky. If war with the United States seemed imminent, Canadian forces would strike first. Small, mobile units would cross into northern U.S. states. They would destroy bridges, railroads, and supply depots, not to win, but to delay. Every hour gained would be another hour for Britain to mobilize. But even Canadian leaders understood the truth. In a full-scale war with the United States, Canada could not stand alone for long. Victory depended on allies, and history was about to choose sides. By the mid-1930s, the world began to change again. A new danger rose in Europe. Nazi Germany. In Asia, Imperial Japan expanded aggressively. Suddenly, the idea of war between the United States and Britain felt less realistic and less important. Old rivals became necessary partners. When World War II finally erupted, everything changed overnight. Instead of planning invasions, American and Canadian officers stood side by side. Ships that once existed only in hypothetical blockades now escorted convoys together across the Atlantic. Factories in Ontario produced weapons for Allied forces. American troops trained on Canadian soil. War Plan Red was quietly abandoned. No announcement, no ceremony. It was simply no longer needed. But history has a strange way of leaving behind ghosts. When War Plan Red was declassified decades later, people were shocked. How could two friendly nations ever imagine such a war? The answer is uncomfortable, but honest. Military planners do not plan for friendship. They plan for possibility. War Plan Red was never about hatred toward Canada. It was about fear. Fear of surprise. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of being unprepared. And perhaps that is its greatest lesson. Now imagine, just for a moment, that history had gone another way. What if Britain and the United States had drifted apart instead of together? What if diplomacy had failed? What if one cold morning, American troops had crossed north, not as visitors, but as invaders? North America would have been torn apart before World War II even began. The alliances that shaped the modern world might never have formed. The peaceful border we know today could have become one of history's bloodiest fault lines. Some wars reshape nations, others reshape continents, and some are prevented, not by strength, but by restraint. Today, the border remains open. American and Canadian flags fly side by side at crossings. Trade flows. People travel freely. Few stop to think about how close history came to something very different. War Plan Red now exists only in archives. A reminder that even the most peaceful relationships require trust. That power must be balanced with wisdom. and that sometimes the most important wars are the ones that never happen. Pen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of history, like the video, subscribe to Epic Tales, and tell us in the comments, what other hidden war plans should we uncover next? Because history is full of stories the world almost lived through,